Everybody. I think we have a good critical mass.
This meeting is being recorded.
Started. As you have just noticed, this meeting is going to be recorded. So if you are in disagreement with that, you may run away now. If not, please stay for the main event. Welcome to this BBL with the title Evaluating Policy Influence with Process Tracing. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our main speaker of today, which is Professor Derek Beach of Aarhus University, and I hope I pronounced it well. As you may know, Derek, he is a global expert on process tracing, which is a very specific technique for causal inference. And Derek has also co-authored one of the principal textbooks on this methodology. He has also worked with evaluation colleagues from different institutions in the field of development cooperation and beyond in the application of process tracing and evaluation. Derek, he is an academic fellow at IEG, and as you know, due to COVID-19, we had to put our academic fellows program on hold. So we are very happy that we can get started again, and we are very happy to have Derek with us at IEG. And at IEG, Derek has been working with our esteemed colleague Estelle Raimondo in the application of process tracing in the Morocco country program evaluation. So the running order for today's event will be pretty straightforward. Derek will start with a presentation in which he will discuss what process tracing is about and how it can be applied in the analysis of causal inference. And then we will give the floor to Estelle Raimondo, Senior Evaluation Officer at IEG. And Estelle will tell us a little bit more about the specific applicability of process tracing in the context of evaluation at the World Bank Group. And then we will have a little bit of time for Q&A. While our speakers are speaking, we kindly ask you to put in any questions, comments, or reflections on the topic in the chat so we can take that up in the last part of this session when we have our Q&A. So without further ado, it's now my great pleasure to give the floor to Derek. Over to you.
All right. Thank you. And thank you so much for this invitation and the opportunity to be here and meet and work with so many really interesting colleagues. So I'm a political scientist, and substantively I do research on policy influence of expert actors in high-level EU decision-making. So that's substantively what I do research on. Methodologically, I use process tracing as the primary research method. And it's in this capacity, kind of developing this method, that I'm here at the IEG, but also I'll be continuing work in the next couple of years, trying to translate some of these methods and bring the key innovations, make them feasible and workable. At the same time, it's very much a work in progress in the form of there are a lot of things that we don't know. In particular, probably the learning aspect is something that so learning from process evaluations is creating some kind of repository of process or how does it work type of knowledge is something that we still are developing exactly how to do. So these are things that I'm piloting in connection with some other work, but also in collaboration with Estelle and others. So let me get to the heart of the talk. I'll try to keep it brief. So basically, process tracing is a method for investigating how interventions work. And it's a within case method, meaning you take a case and you explore how did this project or broader intervention actually work within a given case. The strength of process tracing as a method is it arguably, alongside of certain impact evaluation methods, is the only way we can really make causal inferences when we're doing evaluation. But it has a comparative strength that you can also capture, at least indirectly, how things work. So the more process-focused knowledge that we don't get from an impact evaluation, but it's also in particularly strong at studying, you could call, less tangible interventions. So for example, policy influence is always going to be a slippery contribution to capture empirically. But process tracing arguably at least allows you to provide some evidence for how something, for example, like a diagnostic work, actually can contribute to a reform agenda in a country. The downside of process tracing, and that's also important to flag, is that you learn a lot about a little. You typically are studying one or only a small number of cases, at least with I would say full bore process tracing. Although once you've studied process tracing of a small set of cases, then you could do something like a process tracing light. We can come back to that, for example, in the Q&A. But it's also very evidence demanding. So this is something, it's a very powerful tool in theory, at least if you can gain access to evidence, but it takes time and it's relatively resource demanding. So it's definitely not a panacea or one method for any situation. So the basic and I would say process tracing as a method is actually not very complicated. It's all in the name. So what are we tracing? We're tracing a process. That's a process theory that disaggregates a chain of activities and interactions that produces a contribution, some form of contribution. And then the tracing is basically trying to trace that theory using empirical fingerprints left by the activities. So this is basically, and if we're say, let's do a theory testing process tracing, this would be, for example, we'd start by conceptualizing some type of process theory of change, you could call it, or process theory of action. So this is the top part of the figure where we develop an idea about the intervention and then entities or actors doing things, and then that they link to the next part. We could operationalize that in the form of, okay, well, if this activity and linkage took place, what would we expect for that part of the process? What would we expect to find empirically? And then you go out and you collect and evaluate evidence. At the end of the day, good process tracing, I think, is really driven by developing a relatively simple but still disaggregated process theory, and then using that process theory as almost, you could think of as a like a clothes hanger where you can hang up different pieces of evidence to evaluate what you have evidence of. Of course, if things are not working as you theorize, then you revise your theory. So let me talk about process tracing, and I will talk a little bit about, which is perhaps a little bit outside of the scope of a lot of the evaluation world, but more on the front end of projects. But I'm going to use that to talk about process theories. So process theory or process tracing as a broader methodology can be used in each part or phase of a development intervention. So in the planning and design phase, you could use, we'll say, basically strategic project design using a process theory of change, and this is in relation to a lot of what's otherwise done in result-based management, where I think that we're often not very good at actually theorizing what the contribution is. We actually think that this intervention, just producing a knowledge product is just producing a knowledge product. If we want to influence in some form policy in a given country, for example, making them more interested in some desired reform, we need to developing the how question, developing that process theory of change also can give you a good idea about what is actually a realistic contribution that this intervention, for example, publishing a knowledge product, how could that actually produce policy influence? So theorizing the process theory during the design phase can actually help you define a realistic contribution. And of course, you've theorized also a plan of action or how the project should actually be performed, at least in theory. Your process theory, once you've theorized that, then can also in theory be used for monitoring the implementation or the progress of a given intervention. And as I'll come back to, I think a process theory of change can provide maybe more meaningful indicators of progress in relation to how a project is working. And then the final, and this is what I'll talk about in the final part of this talk, is the more evaluation and learning. So process tracing then, where you use your initial process theory, for example, as a benchmark, you assess the evidence. Did it work as you expected? If not, then you revise it. So I'll unpack each of these a little bit more, each of these steps now. So the theorization, and here again, I'm talking about planning design, but this would be no different than if you're actually evaluating the project. Ideally, when you get a given project in, there should be some form of process theory of change about how this given intervention can produce a desired outcome. Unfortunately, a lot of the existing ways that we theorize projects interventions is, I would say, a common denominator if it's a log frame analysis or even what we call contribution analysis. So these theories of change often black box or treat the causal linkages in the process as assumptions. And let me just use a quick example. So here we have from the work of John Main, a simplified theory of change. And as you can see, actually these arrows in the theory of the theory of change are assumptions. So we assume that, well, if this, then that, but we don't actually unpack theoretically how does, for example, a given intervention or activities by producing a knowledge product, could we actually think about that impacting an actor to change their behavior, et cetera, down through the chain. So it just as an example, and this is an oft-used example in evaluation, of course, more teaching, but this is one that John Main uses. This intervention, a training of mothers on nutrition benefits. And let me just highlight one part of this and show you, talk to you for a second about why it's not good to put the linkages in as assumptions. Because here we can see one part of the process is we have, well, mothers acquire new capacity, and then mothers adopt new feeding practices. But when I look at this theory of change, I don't know why these mothers would actually be adopting these new feeding processes. What is the theorized linkage? Is it because these mothers think, wow, this teacher is a real expert, and therefore I just accept their diagnosis and guidance? Or could it be maybe that the teacher has given them small examples, vignettes, or actually encourage the mothers to experiment, and it then through experimentation that the mother says, oh, well, you know what, actually this makes sense, and maybe I should adopt it. And depending upon what kind of linkage is actually working, we could imagine a program like the implementation designed in very different ways, depending upon why the mothers are adopting these feeding practices. So that's kind of what at the process theory, the core of what process tracing is arguing is that those linkages should be made as explicit as possible and unpacked to a reasonable degree. So that's where we talk about what's process thinking, theorizing how an intervention can contribute to produce an outcome. And, at least in theory, I think it results in a more focused and realistic definition of a potential contribution, because we then are forced to really be very explicit in, like, why do we think this? But of course, if you can't explain why a given intervention can produce an outcome or a contribution, it's probably because there's not really a clear causal linkage, and then you probably should revise and make it a little bit more realistic, the contribution that you think will be produced. But also at the more theoretical level, it produces a better understanding of how an intervention should be performed. So what is the theory, these types of process theories involve? You could call it a process theory of change or a theory of action. Actually, I'm not exactly sure what terminology we should be using and what would resonate perhaps best in the evaluation community. But the core of this kind of process thinking is it's about production. So this is from Machammer, a quote where he says, causality lies in the production. So it's not a counterfactual or this kind of difference making, but it's the actual production. And that's what we want to theorize. And that's what we also want to study empirically. So what we're doing then is trying to unpack theoretically the interactions of social actors that bind causes or the interventions, and then realistic outcomes or contributions, and then try to capture this productive relationship between your intervention and your contribution. So it's not just the World Bank does this and then we assume that country B does that, but we want to explain theoretically the causal linkages. So why would the country adopt this if the World Bank did that? What is the explanation? At the end of the day, or just basically theorizing how it works. So a conceptual language for theorizing process then could be this, what we know from the natural sciences, and has also been adopted in the literature within political science, where they talk about parts of a process, which are entities, social actors, engaging in activities. And these parts are not just intervening variables. It's like a whole causal story that only makes sense when you have the whole thing included. So your entities are social actors engaging in activities. These are nouns. Your activities are verbs, people doing things, but activities that can impact somebody. So you don't just publish knowledge product, but it's published knowledge product that then is given to country B government or whatever kind of, so that you capture the linkage between an activity and the next actor that we say that is impacted by this activity. And in particular, what you should be doing, and this is what also can be very, very difficult to do, full disclosure, is theorizing the causal logics linking parts together as explicitly as possible. So ideally, each part of your process has a form of a noun, an actor. So World Bank team does something. For example, they frame an issue in a particular way in a knowledge product, and then has a because. So like you explain why that activity could, in theory, what is it about the framing activity that actually could lead the next actor to do something? And by making it explicit, not only do we expose it to you could say, critical thinking and logical thinking, but you also force yourself to study it empirically. And if you just treat it as an assumption, often then we just assume it empirically. But by making the linkage explicit, as explicit as possible, at least in theory, you should try to evidence it as directly as possible. Okay, so using this kind of theorization means that we first have to assess the policy context. Basically, what is the demand for some kind of contribution? It could be decision makers simply do not understand an issue, which would then create a demand for some kind of knowledge-based intervention. We could then identify the potential interventions. So what are the types of interventions? What are the tools and resources available to the bank in this situation? You could think of that as the supply. And then we need to couple that with some behavioral theories from the large literatures, public policy, cognitive psychology, political communication, et cetera, to help you theorize the causal drivers or these pathways, the linkages that are binding these processes together. So it could, for example, be that you draw on a peer learning dynamic from the policy diffusion literature and public policy. So let me just use an example, and then I'll move to the monitoring and evaluation. So let's say that we have a situation where policymakers in country A simply do not understand they lack viable solutions to a problem. So an intervention in that situation could be pairing that country with another country. It could be, okay, we take the Serbs and we pair them with the Italians who have done that given policy reform. And the Serbs then could, in theory, at least learn from the Italians, like, how did it work? How did you make it? And then take that knowledge back. And we could then theorize, so the core causal driver would be something like peer learning, again, building on these policy diffusion and learning literatures. And then we would, ideally, and this is something I've done for another evaluation, this is championing. So we could, for example, have a situation where we have policymakers are lacking viable solutions, and we have a knowledge product is the intervention, the problem or the demand is a lack of problem awareness. So we have an engagement. So this UN organization engages in close dialogue with a focal point from that country, providing evidence to this focal point. The focal point then sees a strategic value in using this kind of information to get what they want domestically. And then we could have ESCWA actually convening a meeting to help produce external linkage, external pressure for change. We could then have the next part then is the opponents of change within the government, or at least are theorized to lack good evidence-based counter arguments and thereby are silenced. And then we get we get the issue put on the agenda. And of course, this is a very simple process theory. There's a lot of stuff going on that might not be theorized, but at least in theory, then you could go out and study this empirically. Okay. All of these activities for each part of your process then, I think, produce meaningful indicators because activities leave traces. So when you're monitoring a project, then you can use these process indicators to see whether the intervention is working as theorized. Instead of often quite arbitrary indicators like, well, what's the knowledge product produced? Did people read it? It would be more, for example, well, then how was it actually used domestically, trying to capture more these causal linkages. But let me just dig a little bit more into then the actual evaluation and learning phases. So we have, let's say that we have some kind of process theory of change, either because somebody in the project team in the planning and design phase actually developed it, somebody in the monitoring phase, for example, developed a process theory of change, or the evaluator starts, instead of just theorizing a theory of change, theorizing a process theory of change. And in an evaluation, then we would use this process theory of change as the baseline. So before you go out and do your research, you should at least have an idea of at least one, it might be multiple pathways and multiple contributions. So you would also typically have to focus on maybe one type of contribution and maybe only a few of the types of causal pathways or drivers. So you'd use your process theory of change as a baseline. You could then engage in an initial probing of your case using this process theory of change. When you encounter empirical discrepancies, because we would use the initial process theory of change and we would develop observables based on that, and we might find, well, no, it actually didn't work that way in this part of the process, and then we would revise our process theory of change, and we would keep, say, learning or letting the evidence speak in relation to our process theory of change until we end up with a revised process theory of change that is good enough in relation to our research purpose. So if we really need to understand the causal process in detail, and we really need to have strong evidence, well, then it would be a long evaluation process. Or if it more be like almost like a plausibility probe, we at least make it plausible that this is how it worked, but keep it very simple. That, of course, would mean it would be very different lengths of the evaluation. And then we would have some form of lesson drawing, what I'll come back to in a second. So we're not making inferences using counterfactual comparisons. Instead, what we're using as evidence are the observable manifestations of activities. So you could call this process evidence. In the philosophy of science, they call it mechanistic evidence. And in particular, it's the correspondence between the theorized activity and what we're actually finding out in the real world that helps us make inferences. And then the causal inferences are, especially when you're able to not only say this was this activity, but you can show that this activity had some discernible impact, or you're kind of tracing the causal forces, you're able to get a bit closer to the actual linkage between one actor doing activity and the next actor doing another activity in response. And this could be direct process evidence in the form of perhaps a cluster of evidence that really captures the causal linkage, or typically more realistically, empirical, more indirect process evidence that makes it more likely that there was a linkage. This might be finding correspondence in, for example, the text of a knowledge product, and then afterwards the reform that is adopted. And if we see parts of the reform that very closely map onto ideas that were put forward by the bank, and we can see that at the time the bank was the only one putting forward these ideas, and they came at them independently, and there was some kind of engagement between the World Bank, the knowledge product team, and the government, for example, we can then begin to say, well, okay, we can't actually see the linkages, but we can more indirectly say that there's at least evidence suggesting that there's a plausible linkage. Okay, and then what we're doing then is the evaluation of the probative value of evidence, asking questions inspired by Bayesian reasoning, although I am not a big fan of the more formal variant of this. I think we can translate these into very simple questions that actual evaluators can use. So let me just briefly, and then I'll spend 2 minutes talking about learning, and then I'll open we'll send the word over to Estelle. So we have, for each part of the process, we have some actor engaging in an activity. We would then expect certain manifestations, at least in theory, to be present. The questions we ask then when we're evaluating probative value would be, well, do we have to find this observable? And if we find the observable, are there alternative explanations for finding it? And of course, evidence in theory is still evidence in theory, because then we have to go out and collect actual sources of evidence. And there we have to ask ourselves, well, is this source, have we actually found the evidence that we think we found, and can we trust it? Just as an example, you could say, well, an actor engaging activity, of course, this has nothing to do with evaluation and development. But if it's, for example, a suspect committed a crime, then you could say, in theory, a confessional could be very strong evidence that the activity actually took place. But if the source of evidence comes from something as abhorrent as torture, we, of course, cannot trust that source. So even though in theory, the confessional was really strong, the actual source, then we cannot trust it. So ergo, it's not evidence. And my recommendation regarding the tracing side of process tracing is spending a lot of time thinking about, well, here's our theory, and then kind of going up and down in this figure, really thinking about, what do I have evidence of? So empirical material is just empirical material. It's only evidence when you have evaluated what it tells you about whether an activity took place or not. And evidence then can take the form of patterns, for example, media communication. This is a Talkwalker output. It could be traces, for example, what people are actually, the content of documents. So here's a World Bank fingerprint in a speech by the Moroccan king. It could be sequences, so events in sequence, or accounts, what actors tell us. So basically anything that tells us something about an activity, empirical material that can tell us about whether an activity took place, is evidence. Okay, finally, learning. So process tracing focuses on two types of cases. The one are what we could call typical cases, where we have an intervention and then some kind of contribution. You could say these are positive cases, the intervention and the outcome is present. And once we understand the typical, then another type of case is interesting, the deviant case, where we have an intervention, but it's not working as we otherwise have seen it works in other cases. And those deviant cases are very interesting to also do theoretical revision process tracing on, where we're basically trying to trace a process until it breaks down and then understand why it broke down by comparing that with a typical case. But again, process tracing typically only studies these typical cases, and you might only study a few cases. So how do we actually extract any reasonable knowledge from process tracing? Because are we not just studying Morocco, and then how do I know it's going to work in a similar way in Algeria? Well, that's where studying multiple cases at the process level takes place. But in particular, it's really thinking about what your case is a case of, and using causal theory, or you say mid-range theories about the process that can help you go beyond just studying the single case. So we maybe have studied peer learning in the Moroccan case, and then we could study some form of peer learning dynamic where country A is paired with country B. Maybe let's say the Serbs did it. Okay, well then we have 2 case studies, and then we can think about the context of each of those cases, and then try to start building up some kind of repository of knowledge about pathways and context. So using theory to sort and compare lessons from cases, and ideally, and this is something that we're going to be in my research project also going to be piloting in the next year or so, is trying to build up repositories of knowledge of what works, basically, or this kind of process knowledge. So using relatively simple causal drivers, pathways, as a way of sorting what kind of lessons we're drawing from given cases, and then trying to use relatively simple information about the context then to be able to figure out what works where. And of course, going back to studying cases, our case studies, you don't always have to do really in-depth process tracing. It could be that you only study 1 or 2 cases in depth. So differing levels of theoretical aggregation or disaggregation and evidential support. So you can think of process tracing as kind of like a continuum of really unpacked process theories, maybe of a few cases, and then comparing at a more abstract level across a lot more cases, kind of using some kind of quick and dirty process tracing to get better ideas about under what conditions does, for example, how does peer learning work in this kind of context versus maybe a lower developed context. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here and turn the floor over then to Estelle, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Derek. Sorry, Estelle, to interrupt. I just wanted to make a brief remark to our colleagues. Please insert any questions that you have into the chat so we can get the discussion started. Apologies, Estelle, over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Derek, for your talk, and also for spending a week mostly with me. We were hoping for more, in-person interaction, but we had many really good conversations, even if they were mostly online. So just thank you for that. I'll keep my remarks quite brief because I'm eager to hear from you, but I had kind of 3 sets of thoughts on your talk. The first is to try to think about, this promise of process tracing by reflecting on what would be our needs from an organizational point of view. Then I'll give you my thoughts on what I consider to be the promise, and also a few reflections from the lessons from early applications of you and I working together, but also I've seen other applications in the field and what I see the challenges and the lessons there. So I just wanted to go back to basically the problem at hand, which is that we have a pretty big blind spots at the bank, but not only at the bank, on a number of interventions that we do routinely, but that have fallen through the cracks of the result systems because of how it's been built and because of how we consider evidence. What do we consider evidence to be? So a couple of years ago, we did this study, country outcome orientation, where we took a take on the results systems at the country level, and we found out something again that was well known, but we managed to go a little bit deeper. That we had as an organization only a partial picture of what the bank group contributed at the country level, because the policy influencing, even certain mechanisms of policy financing, the knowledge work, the dialogue, the convening, all of that fell through the cracks of the results systems, was not really made explicit in how we were doing our country partnership frameworks. The learning was mostly really tacit and experiential, and ultimately we were not really able to capture those contributions, but also the cases of failure. And so I think this is not a secret. People working in the bank know that, but we have an opening in some ways in thinking through how could we start bridging those gaps. And why is this important? It's not just for accountability and accounting for results. It's also because, as an organization, we pride ourselves into being a knowledge bank. We have, years after years, really important knowledge products that are delivered, whether it's the country economic memorandum, now new diagnostic work on climate, etc., etc. We have very deep also, sector, country-specific research, and ultimately, it's very hard for us to know, what works under what circumstances. How do we make a contribution, and how could we have a knowledge system that can, capture some of these and wouldn't leave it entirely to the world of tacit and experiential. Again, this is not a World Bank only problem. Many organizations are struggling with this. So what would be the promise for me of thinking in terms of process theory more broadly and process tracing approaches more specifically? Well, it's that it allows us to have a dialogue on questioning some of the tenets of our own result systems already. So we've gotten to this point because we have a set of deep-rooted belief on, what does evidence count for evidence. So we're all tending towards metrics, towards what can be attributed, what can be aggregated. We report things, the mix of our results and our accomplishments are usually averages. And so thinking in terms of process theory and process tracing kind of goes against this grain. And so I find it particularly helpful because it provides at least an horizon for a solution in some ways. And the second thing is that to put this in place, what you have talked about or hinted at also requires quite a set of switches. And so it would force us to be more specific in our theories of change about what the World Bank group contribution or what particular partners is really about. And our Director General is always telling us that in that nice flow chart or nice log frame or nice theory of change, where is the bank? What are the activities? What is its comparative advantage? How can we make it more explicit? So that's one promise. The second is that it would allow us to be more cognizant of these arrows, these black boxes, where most of the practical knowledge is actually embedded, and we don't unpack these. And so then it becomes very difficult for us evaluators to draw lessons. Our managers and directors are always after us also saying, okay, this is very generic. how can we have really practical lessons? And I think process tracing can help us in that. And then it helps us thinking more critically about our evidence. It's not just relying on the most readily available metrics or the ratings that we have been using for years after years under every single possible context, but really thinking about what is this evidence of and what is this not evidence of. So as you were mentioning, I think there is a really nice promise here. And then your promise of building a repository of knowledge is of course really enticing. Many have tried before. I'm thinking also of the global initiative, the delivery initiative, trying to really think about how do you generalize and learn from cases in context. And I still somehow really want something to work, and so this is something that I'm really interested in. So, what would we need to make this happen? We, of course, need to realize that our own resource systems, in which we have invested a lot and we're wedded to for very good reason, and it serves really good purposes, doesn't serve all of the purposes for knowledge evaluation. And so we need something else. So we need to start thinking in terms of, what are typical phases of policy processes? This is very well established in the policy literature, but we don't use it in terms of thinking about our planning, monitoring, and evaluation of policy-related work, whether it's the policy dialogue, the knowledge, or even the policy financing. We would need, typologies of what is called mechanisms, or how we trigger these changes. So you were mentioning peer learning, trust building, empowering champions, reaction to data optics, naming and shaming. All of these are things that we are trying to do, as well as informing what. But we don't have a good framework to organize that knowledge and have it accumulate in some ways and travel across cases. And then these typologies of context, so it's not just country A and country B. This is not particularly helpful, but it's, type of polities or type of political economies or even types of problems. And that would start also help us to, make more out of one cases or multiple cases, because of course we can't invest in really good process tracing for all our analytical work, policy work, etc., etc. So just to close, what I've learned myself from being engaged and learning on process tracing is that basically I've never seen a theory of change unfold so vividly than when I was doing a process tracing in the Dominican Republic. For instance, it really spoke and it was there and it was vivid. A second thing is that I've never thought more critically about my sources of evidence than when I was trying to embark on process tracing and just, questioning whether that source was the right one and not taking it for granted. And then it was never easier for me to draw lessons in practice in context than after being involved in a process tracing in some way. So these were really good takeaways. At the same time, I also had to overcome a lot of what a good friend and colleague Tom Aston calls the alchemist problem, which is that process tracing has come into evaluation through a very jargonistic, formulaic way. And I think we need to, sort things out, what works for us and what does not. And maybe the formalized Bayesian process tracing needs to be refined, or we're not there yet. For now, I don't really see it extremely useful. And it also means that we need to be approachable and accessible to managers, to people who are implementing, and really have a good way of communicating what we are after. And I think that's still a big challenge for us. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Estelle. Thank you, Derek, for this very interesting introduction into process tracing and how it can be used in evaluation. Also, thank you, Estelle, for reflecting on what are some of the benefits and also some of the challenges and also some of the requirements for applying process tracing in our evaluative practice. Derek, I would like to give you 1 or 2 minutes to briefly respond to some of the questions that Estelle raised, and then I will have a number of questions for both of you from the audience. So, Derek, over to you.
think actually I was actually really focusing on the questions from the audience. So I'd like to maybe move to that. I mean, I think everything that
Sure.
Estelle says is correct, and I'm fully on board also on the challenges. So yeah.
So one particular question that struck me from Estelle, which I fully agree with, is we need to become more specific about how our interventions work, but then we also need to have the right frameworks to organize that knowledge so we can learn about what works across contexts. So that is something maybe to think about, but maybe we can come back to that. But let me start with some questions from the audience. So this is a question for you, Derek. Or Lauren asks, how do you deal with bias? How do you manage bias in reporting on evidence, especially when we are talking about historical events and few people may be recalling what really happened, or there may be explicit, managing the information when there's, a response to an interviewer. And then the second question is, how do you get to the why? How much probing is needed in order to understand a causal process? And then one question for you immediately after Estelle is a question that Željko raised on the different evaluation criteria. So maybe you can say something, Estelle, about how does process tracing fit with looking at the criterion of effectiveness, and is it also applicable around questions of relevance and coherence? Maybe you could say something about that. So over to you, Derek.
Okay, let me just be brief on the bias. This is, of course, always a problem. In theory, a major source of our evidence is stakeholders. And there's a reason why historians, for example, would never use participant interviews, because they don't believe they can be trusted. And this is also one of the things we would say the key thing when you're evaluating evidence is always thinking about, well, two things. One is, are there alternative explanations for finding this evidence? But also, can I trust the source? Does this source have motivations? And when you're forced to ask those questions of each piece of, or at least the major pieces of evidence, this also sheds light on that not all evidence is created equal. So there are situations where you might actually maybe even were a participant and you could really observe, yes, in this meeting, the Ghanaians, started just talking in a different way after several interventions, during the meeting, et cetera. So you actually have really good evidence of, you can see behavioral changes, whereas often we're asking people, and at the end of the day, if you're just asking people, why did you do this or this kind of thing, it's probably quite weak evidence. But then you should just flag that and say, okay, for this linkage, I just have relatively weak evidence, but even weak evidence is better than no evidence. On the why question, and this kind of also relates to this, we're dealing with social actors. So of course, motivations, intentions, and perceptions of how you perceive actions. I mean, ideally, you would be talking to stakeholders on all the different sides and not only trying to figure out what they're doing, but at least what they're willing to tell you regarding why they're doing it. So motivations, intentions, and then also how you perceive things. How you perceive the activities of others is, on top of other types of evidence, also relevant evidence to try and evidence that linkage of a why. But it's not the only evidence, and it should not be the only evidence. Of course, it's quite subjective, so it should be treated, source critically. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Estelle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question on, I think so. Process tracing is very much causal analysis methods, which for our own purposes would be much more around effectiveness type of questions. And Željko makes a good point that if you look at coherence, then you need to look at also at multiple streams of activities or multiple sets of policy advice that come together in a way. So it would be possible, but more onerous. On the relevance part, I think it's, it's the power is in the having multiple cases, and understanding, to what extent a particular set of activities were relevant in context, but then to really judge, was it the right way to go about it? You need multiple cases. So it's also not necessarily a good place to start if your question is just, did we do the right thing for this particular case? There are other approaches that would be better, but it can give us ultimately more knowledge with multiple cases.
Thank you, Estelle. Then again, another question for each one of you. First, a question for Derek by Kennedy Kibuko, which is about an adaptive approach in designing a process theory of change. So if the theory of change was developed in an adaptive manner, what are there any applications for the evaluation of their project? That is one question for you, Derek. And then one question for you, Estelle, is by Andrew Stone. Process tracing light. So process tracing is very demanding in terms of evidence. What would process tracing light mean? Would that mean in cases where there's very little evidence that you use other methods as well? Or is this just accounted for in the process tracing method itself? And what is the relationship between process tracing and contribution analysis? And if you like, you can also talk to each other's questions if you like. Derek, you can start.
Yeah, just first on the contribution analysis. So if you Google Derek Beach journal evaluation, I've written a couple articles that discuss this together with some colleagues on the difference between contribution analysis, and it's in particular this assumptions. But on the adaptive, I mean, in theory, the process tracing used as an evaluation, or in general as a case theory-based kind of case study method, is using what we would call an abductive research design. So it's neither deductive nor inductive. It's not like grounded theory where the evidence is supposedly just speaking, and it's not a purely deductive, but it's a dialogue between process theories and broader, we say, causal theories from the behavioral sciences and the empirics. So it provides a kind of this back and forth. Ideally, what you're letting is the evidence speak in relation, again, in dialogue with existing causal theories. So you should never think that, well, you'll just have you as an evaluation setting, you go out and you theorize your process theory, and then you go out and you find it worked that way. I would say my own experience from doing quite a few process tracing case studies of policy influence is that it never works the way you thought initially. So it's always going to be this dialogue back and forth. This doesn't mean, and I would say the process tracing light, which I could see as another question later, this doesn't mean that you necessarily need to do that kind of full bore, all of the different pathways and all the different activities, et cetera. You can focus on particular parts or you would say particular pathways, but you can also theorize them in a much more simple, abstract way. So not all of the working parts, just the key parts of your causal story. A metaphor I like to use when I teach this is saying it's basically it's your movie, and you can decide where you use your special effects money. And ideally, just like in a James Bond movie, you use your special effects money where the causal story gets really interesting. And where the rest of the movie maybe is a year and a half of time, but then the final 20 minutes of the movie corresponds to 20 minutes in time, real time, because that's where the story really gets interesting. And you can do something similar in process tracing, where you say, okay, I'm really interested in the policy engagement, but in this particular kind of part of the process, and then you kind of scope that out, and then the rest is kind of, I wouldn't say black box, but it's not as interesting, so you don't spend so much time dealing with that.
Just a couple of thoughts on the light, but also there is a question from Mallory about how complicated is it, and can smaller organizations, NGOs, get into this space? So my sense is that you can actually draw the benefits of process tracing, which to me were, if you really pare it down, is thinking about your theory of change differently, of really thinking about the how, and thinking ex ante about that really specific contribution applied to things that we consider hard to measure. That's one. The second is really thinking critically about the evidence collected, and applying Bayesian thinking. Updating is just, I think Derek says, it's just good learning, or it's just good research in some ways, and having a bit of a framework to do that more than we would in typical process evaluation, and in a way that is very accessible. And so already having that, and then I just wanted to signal that the Global Partnership for Social Accountability at the bank, the GPSA, which works with smaller actors, NGO, and has really done some good experimenting with process tracing and making it more accessible, making it simpler. So there is work out there as well. That I wanted to signal. The last thing is, when we did it, for instance, for the citizen engagement evaluation, we did a fairly rigorous process tracing on one case that we had selected well, and then we draw these lessons to our portfolio review. So we used it to really inform other types of data collection and analysis that were not as heavy and demanding. So it's also thinking critically about the one or two cases that you want to use and make the most of them. And then I see there is a passionate debate between Jeff and Derek, and I was expecting that. So I'm glad this is happening on the chat.
Well, actually, it's coming to the surface now, because I'm going to ask you to react on it a little bit more. Well, there are three questions that I briefly want to pose to both of you. One is a very difficult question by Stephen Hutton. What does it take to actually disconfirm the theory? I think this is related to a lot of aspects that are into process tracing, but maybe you can speak briefly to that point. And then Jeff makes two interesting points. What if there is contrasting findings between counterfactual designs and process tracing designs? I have an answer to that, but I won't say it. And then the second one, what can you say about the fact that process tracing both is about reconstructing the theory and testing the theory? Isn't that subjective? And my response would be, well, I don't see how that would be different from any other method. But I give it over to you. Over to you, Derek.
Estelle, do you want to take a first step?
No, go for it. These are good. For you.
Okay. First on the perhaps subjective. I mean, I would say your force is, I don't think it's actually subjective in the form of when you are really forcing yourself, and this is where the explicit process theory helps you, is you have to justify. You have to be able to justify why you think you have evidence of what you think you have evidence of. And so you can't just say, I have empirical material or I have evidence of this, but you have to justify, I think I have evidence of this, so an activity and a linkage, and then also justifying why you think that empirical material actually is evidence of what you're claiming it's evidence of. And I would say for those of you interested, I can provide quite a few examples of what this can look like, especially, for example, in evidential appendices, because it really disciplines your what you can get away with. I think often when we don't really explicitly put forward, this is what I think I have evidence of, and justify that, that's when you can get into the situation where people just claim, well, I have strong evidence, this is how it works. But then you start probing, and then it's like, okay, well, you have empirical material, but why is that evidence? And that's where I think this dialogue between the process theory and the empirical material, and justifying then why you're making those inferences and why you think the probative value is what you think it is. is what prevents us, and also leading into I would say the disconfirming. Well, I would say it's not difficult to disconfirm a process theory of change. I do it every time I go out into, because basically when you put forward propositions about evidence that you have to find, and then you don't find it, and you looked and you can trust your sources. Well, in that instance, when you had to find it, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. But of course, if you didn't have to find that evidence, and there's, for example, maybe we don't have access to the empirical material that would enable us to disconfirm. Well, in that instance, because you don't have access, then absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it's only, there's a really cool philosophy of science article on this specific that I've been really by an philosopher named Sober at the University of Wisconsin. I can send the reference if there's anybody that's interested. Just shoot me an email. The contrasting findings, maybe just a brief answer to that would be, I would expect you would have contrasting findings because an impact, an RCT asked very different questions of causal questions. It's asking, does it work, or what's the net causal effect on average across this set of cases? Whereas your process tracing is, using Nancy Cartwright's language, is answering this is how it actually works here. And of course, the RCT, again, provides you with, well, it works somewhere kind of answers. And that is a different question. And you have very different evidence than if you're process tracing that says, well, this is how it works here. And that's of course a different question. That's evidence with different evidence. So there, I would say almost per definition, they're asking different questions. So of course you might have quite contrasting evidence. And then the core question, and I don't think we've answered this question, is really what to do with this. This is where mixed methodology becomes really interesting. But in all of my reading on the philosophy of science and in applications, I have not actually seen really good evidence or good arguments for how we deal with this question. People like Nancy Cartwright and some of the people around her are kind of probing, and this is also something I'm really interested in, kind of probing for answers to this question. But at the end of the day, we still don't really have a good working vocabulary for dealing with this, because until recently in the broader sciences, we have not been that interested really in taking process seriously. So that's why we don't have a really good methodological answer for how to deal with this contrasting findings question.
Estelle, a few minutes because we are at the end of our time.
I mean, yeah, no, I think these are really good parting thoughts, and there are more questions in the chat. But I think, ultimately, I think we've moved beyond, like, or hopefully having won another method war, or I think we're all for evidential plurality in some ways. Another good term that I thought about this week with Derek, and that if anything, I think we need to just embrace the fact that we have some deep blind spots, and that these blind spots are important to really fill. And so, thinking what approach fits where for what questions is always what we should go after. But where a particular approach has met its limits, then we need to look into alternatives and think in those terms. So that would be my learning from this week. Yeah.
Great, Estelle. I think that is a great conclusion. Plurality of methods, also in causal inference. There are different causal questions and different methods that help you to answer these causal questions. And process tracing is particularly useful in many of the contexts and many of the evaluants in the bank group that we have been kind of ignoring, such as policy advisory work, a lot of the ASA work that the bank group does. So I think process tracing is very, very applicable in that context. Esteemed colleagues, there are more questions in the chat, but we encourage you to write to Derek and to Estelle. I would like to invite you to give a silent, imaginary, virtual applause to our speakers. Thank you very much, Derek, for this very interesting presentation, and thank you very much, Estelle, for your thoughtful remarks on this. This is a very interesting area of work, esteemed colleagues. I'm looking forward to seeing more empirical applications in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.